Mm. Greetings to baristas. Ah, I know I've made a few videos about democracy. Today I'm going to talk about democratization, which is a different thing altogether, and the difference between them. How the latter is related to another Greek concept, the Trojan horse, or Trojan horse if you want the correct pronunciation. You know the story. A flattering gift is made to the enemy, who are lured into celebration, and while they're sleeping it off, out of the horse's belly comes the real purpose, men with arms, out to conquer and enslave the besotted Trojans. Well, what does that have to do with democracy? If you'll note, I did not say anything about democracy in that scenario. Democracy is when citizens organize themselves to participate in self-government. Democratization is a process of organizing people from outside to hustle them into a process controlled from above and beyond them by special and private interests for purposes which are irrelevant when not hostile to their true interests. Democratization is a Chicago war heel getting out the vote for the party on election day. Then, once the voters have voted early and often, that is, served their purpose at the voting booth, then hustling them out and back where they belong, leaving it to the tried and true professionals to run things, all for the public good, of course. Their first duty is to the contributors, the investors, that made the campaign possible. And if someone happens to get rich in the process, well, isn't free market profit the other side of the coin? What else is the process for? This purely legalistic formula of democratic process, like due process in law, is what's pushed abroad as democratization. Thomas Carothers of the Carnegie Endowment was active in the democracy assistance biz outside the US and A, in Latin America and Romania, in the last couple decades of the 20th century. He wrote in general terms that U.S. policy toward Central and Eastern Europe since 1989 has been based on the idea that transitions to democracy and market economies are mutually reinforcing. By increasing the free flow of information, empowering individuals, and making governments more accountable, U.S. officials argue that democratization will facilitate the transition to a market economy. In parallel fashion, by establishing private property, reducing the leverage of the state over the lives of individuals, and raising the overall socio-economic level of the population, the transition to a market economy can strengthen democratization. Well, fine and dandy, but did this work in any measurable way toward promoting democracy? Carothers himself noted that these non-governmental organizations are essentially missionary societies funded by outside groups with the purpose of indoctrinating natives in the one true Western faith. As such, though he didn't take his insight to its logical conclusion, they cannot be democratic because they are imposed and non-self-sustaining, depending on outside investors to continue functioning. This is what civil society initiatives have amounted to in practice. Because they serve the interests of their funders, because the donations go to the non-governmental organizations and not directly to the targeted people, they cannot create any significant number of converts, no matter how great the objective need for their services. The same dilemma also be said to the Communist Party of Romania in 1944, because its mission was set by an outside power pursuing that power's agenda. Western market-based democratization, when it's projected abroad, likewise has no democratic support because of its external missionary nature. People see through its pretenses and self-interest very quickly, but in areas of vital interest to the West, it will insist on the democratization process, even if it's enforced through the barrel of a gun. To be sure, many of the projects the democratizers wish to promote are worthy in themselves. Human rights in general, and specific minority, religious, women's, children, and gay rights, or environmental protection. The same was true in 1944, land reform, denazification, public control over assets and production. But one thing is lacking in missionary projects of whatever denomination: the right of people to accept or reject, to interpret things for themselves. In other words, freedom of choice. Despite Milton Friedman, there was no freedom to choose in 1989 any more than in 1944. Stalin said then, one must impose one's social system as far as one's armies can reach. Just like Stalin, Margaret Thatcher was honest enough to say it plain. There is no alternative, the infamous Tina doctrine. There is no right to say no, and NATO is on hand to make sure the masses vote yes, and democratization becomes the law of the land. Just like at home, the investor state that calls itself democracy is all about the empowerment and profit of outside interests located in Washington, New York, London, and Brussels. A weak, feminine government that serves as executive secretary to the real boss man. We've seen it at work recently in Iraq and Afghanistan, while the boss man wonders why his secretarial state is too weak to effectively govern. It's because, learn policy dumbasses, your satellite regimes have no real sovereignty and it's no legitimacy to the people they rule. And at bottom, you know that as well as they do. An earlier look at democratizing missionary work was by David Chandler, a Brit at Leeds Metropolitan University in Bosnia back in the 1990s. And he wrote in his Faking Democracy After Dayton, what distinguishes democratization is that it is a process, a framework of self-flattery while legitimizing a relationship of domination. It showed its form over substance, and its goal is not to liberate, not to empower, but to create submission to the economic elites of Western capitals and to the political order they control. Again, that's no different than what's done at home. The democratizing missionaries can be so sincere about their multi-party states and rule of law they build elsewhere precisely because, just like down home, form rules content. As long as Joe Sixpack or Hamid Hookah has cast his ballot electronically or by punch, it's immaterial if the man he's voted for takes capital in a private market transaction, in other words, cash under the table, to do the very opposite of whatever he promised. The point is that Joe and Hamid did what was expected of them. That's the extent of their participation in the democratic process, of their civic duty, and the extent of civil society as understood in Western democratization. Just as in the legal system, as long as you can have your day in court, you've had due process, and all is therefore fair. It doesn't matter if the content is unaffordable to you, as in being unable to afford an adequate lawyer, or to file the appeal when he loses, you had your shot in the game. To ask for more would be to threaten the very institutions of Western representative government and law, because these are not founded on responsibility to those who are ruled, or on real participating self-rule, but on protecting state interest and vested property, which are perceived as identical. Again, obverse sides of that same hard coin. Citizens United has done one thing. It's cut through the compost heap of democratization rhetoric. It's made things quite clear, just like Stalin or Margaret Thatcher. You have the civic or legal rights you can pay for. So democratization in Bosnia in 1995 and the USA in 2012 are thus moving indistinguishably closer to one another, while decision-making recedes farther from public sight. You'll cast your ballot this fall for whichever Trojan breed strikes your fancy, and as soon as you're sleeping it off, out will come the surprise and the cold, hard blade in your sleep-warm flesh. Oh, about time for that, wasn't it? Hello? Who's this? Can't hardly understand you, dude. Oh, you're wearing a mask, and you can't take it off? Why? Because you're a lone gunman who's just gone berserk and shot up a bunch of people? Well, thanks for calling and putting my number in your electronic communication device. So, Mr. Gunman, why did you go berserk and shoot up a bunch of people? Did they ever do anything to hurt you? What do you mean you felt pissed off and weren't going to take it anymore and had to do something? Man, we live in a free country where everyone has the democratic right to express himself and make his voice count, where every person is equal before the law. That's the democratic process. He hung up. Apparently I wasn't getting through to him. He was just talking crazy.